Welcome to Transforming Medical Communications, a podcast by MedComms experts. We share medical communications insights and advice from the best and brightest in the industry to find out what they're doing to push our industry forward. Here's your host, Wesley Porteges.
Welcome to Transforming Medical Communications, the podcast where we explore bold ideas shaping the future of medical affairs. Today, we're joined by Kimberly Eskridge-Rose, a visionary leader in medical affairs, celebrated for championing digital innovation and driving impactful change across the industry. In this episode, we're unpacking how to build a compelling social media presence for medical affairs teams, the art of partnering with compliance as a strategic ally rather than a gatekeeper, and what it truly takes to evolve from isolated pilots to a scalable, integrated strategy. Kimberly, it's a pleasure to have you. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Wesley. Thanks so much for having me today.
It's a pleasure. So maybe to start us off, could you share a defining moment in your career? Maybe something that fundamentally shaped how you think about medical communications today.
Sure, absolutely. So I guess I'll start off by sharing that I've been in the industry for quite some time, right? Started off in the field medical. And at that point, I probably really didn't have a great sense of how important, medical communications really were in terms of an overall medical affairs strategy and really what we meant even with medical communications. But, at some point as I transitioned into, different roles and started with some leadership opportunities within field medical, I was really introduced to a medical communication strategy in an SCP. And I have to say that was really eye-opening for me because I really, had a peek behind the curtain into the effort that went into ensuring that the information that you share out through medical affairs is, consistent and credible, and that you share information in a very specific, manner. And that really opened my eyes, right? I also saw that translate externally. And so at the time I was working in oncology, and, within oncology, you have just volumes of data and information. And I really saw how important it was to have a strategy around how you communicate. So after several years on the pharma side, I had an opportunity to move on to the agency side to launch a MedComms company with actually a former colleague from Sanofi. And, I have to say, it was never my intention to work on that side, right? Like it was never, I wish I could say I had a vision for it, but I really did not. It was really opportunity driven. But I have to say, I found it to be very rewarding to kind of understand, right, that side of the business and the support that you provide to companies and helping them with everything from their MedCom strategy through to just overall medical affairs consulting, which is, I feel like, the part that I enjoyed the most. And so spent 7 years on that side, and then decided I wanted to transfer, back over into the pharmaceutical biotech side.
Yeah, well, I can only imagine it's very helpful to see it always from both sides, right?
For sure. Yes.
Yeah. Hey, Kimberly, so in my discussions with many medical affairs leaders, I kind of feel that many of them still see social media as risky or out of reach. Sometimes, of course, the compliance hurdle coming up quickly and maybe not trying to, break through that boundary.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering what inspired you to champion this space so boldly and what made it personal or pertinent for you?
I think for us, it was really driven because we saw our, stakeholder mix, our, nephrologists and other nephrology HCPs, we saw them operating in the space. And so, it led to us really investigating, well, what's happening in the space and why are they there and what are they doing there? What type of information, right, are they receiving or sharing, and what's the intent behind it? And so that really opened our eyes to the opportunity, right? But like many people, right, it almost seemed like too big to tackle, right? Like social media, there are so many, regulations, and we can't just jump in and, not have a fully fleshed out plan. But what really convinced us that we needed to do this is we saw misinformation in the space, right? We saw, people weren't doing it on purpose, but there was just misinterpretation of data, from studies or, from the literature. And we say, wow, social media is great, but with the volume of information and at the pace, misinformation is actually a big piece of it. And we felt like, as a medical affairs organization, we had, a responsibility actually to see if we could help provide, more credible, scientific information for folks.
Wow, that's interesting. I never expected that answer actually. And so what you're saying is like, if you don't communicate on social media as medical affairs, you risk that other people are going to do so on your behalf in a way, but not necessarily correctly.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. That, folks are out there talking about it. So whether or not you're there or not, they're talking about, right, the data and the disease state and everything, because it's a public forum and it's available. And, we really saw two aspects that were important. One, we felt like we could contribute to the conversation, right, in a very peer, right, credible way, that very much the way that we engage with, stakeholders in the field or, at congresses. But we also saw that in some cases, some voices were greater than others. And there was an opportunity to ensure they had the very best and most recent information, so that they were sharing credible information. Because no one intends to get on there and misrepresent something. Right. Often they're just not aware that there's additional data or information to share.
Yeah, and then basically as an organization, you're not there to kind of course correct the information, right? That makes sense to me. Now, when you started looking into this, you made some choices around which platforms to use, right? And what I see with most medical affairs teams is that they're defaulting to LinkedIn. I think that is typically seen as safe, familiar, and maybe expected. And you kind of went the other way, right? You went to X first. Can you walk us through what led to that decision?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as we walked into this, we did look across all the platforms, right? We looked to see sort of, how they're structured, how people engage on them and the types of content that you can share. And LinkedIn, of course, was, one of the platforms, and it was a very, people are comfortable with it because people, do a lot on there personally, I feel like, as well as professionally. But we actually decided to go with X for two reasons. One, when we looked at Travere as a whole and where other areas where we have a presence on social media, our corporate communications group has a very strong presence on LinkedIn, right? And so we just said, let's just see, some other channels and where we may have an opportunity to build, a following. And then secondly, and probably more importantly, we looked to see where our stakeholders were. And the majority of our stakeholders at the time were on X. And I have to say, so we're in nephrology. Nephrology is one of the specialty areas that was very progressive in their use of social and digital channels. And so they weren't just there as individuals, they were there as groups and as professional societies. They had a very well-established presence. They did journal clubs and case conferences and, pathology conferences and all of that. And so we knew that was the place for us because they were already there. And so it made perfect sense for us.
Yeah, that makes sense. How did you know about that?
Just from engaging with our stakeholders, really talking, we partnered closely with our field medical team, as they're out engaging. We had them, we started to ask them, are you seeing your folks on social media? And actually, they were really the first group to say, hey guys, our stakeholders, they're not just interacting, face to face and at congresses. They have a whole presence on social media. So they were the ones that kind of really championed, let's look at the opportunity But we basically, through that sort of research, we asked, oh, are you on social media? Oh, what channels are you on? And oh, well, what do you do there? Why do you go there for information? Do you go there to share information or are you there to consume information? And all of that. And so that's how we really validated that that was the right approach for us.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. Because I think very often we make assumptions, right? And it can be different. And I think there's to some extent we can project some of these user behavior on across different therapy areas, but there are differences sometimes, and sometimes there can be stark differences. So I think it's always very important to validate in your particular situation where these people are most and how they interact. And I also liked what you said around like, are you consuming or are you sharing or creating content? Because that's a huge difference. And I think like nowadays we think like a lot of people are creating content because when you go to platforms like YouTube and so on, it's obviously full with content. But I actually heard a statistic that only 1% of the people going on YouTube actually creates content and 99% consumes content, which I found interesting.
That is.
And it also, yeah, and it kind of means that you have quite a good chance if you start creating content, but as you're doing, that is going to be seen and it is going to be like quite impactful because you're one of 1% and not one of the 99%. So I found that like an interesting feel on consuming versus creating content. And
Absolutely.
And that's also why the digital opinion leader projects and these kind of things are quite important in a modern medical communication strategy.
Absolutely. I think, to kind of tag on what you said, we make assumptions. It really is important to, take the time to really do the research to confirm or validate your beliefs. Because in some cases, we had some assumptions and as it turned out, they weren't true. Right. And so, sometimes you're surprised and then sometimes you're right on point, but it helps to know that for sure.
Yeah, well, that's a good point, and good you mentioned that because that was kind of a question I have for you, which is, like a lot of these teams, they worry that HCPs won't really engage with social, right? Like they, on the one hand, they want to be part of it, and at the same hand, it's like, oh, is this actually going to work? And how do we know? Is it maybe seen as a commercial initiative instead of a medical affairs one? So maybe like two questions for you. One is like, what signals told you that your audience was also ready for this? And then how did you validate those assumptions once you started communicating on X?
You know what? So I think what told us, I think there were several signals, right, that our stakeholder group was ready for engagement. The first I really already mentioned, they already had such an established presence in social media, right? And so when we looked specifically to see, well, how are they organized and what are they doing? We saw, definitely leaders who were really prolific in the types of information, right, that they put out. Then we saw, that there was a group who just kind of, pop in and out maybe around a particular Congress, right? Then we saw folks that went there for really advice, like they went there to query their colleagues if they wanted someone to weigh in on a particular topic or if they were, looking for some type of guidance. And so we felt that they were very comfortable with engagement and this sort of dynamic, environment. Now, what we didn't know for sure is whether or not they would be receptive to us as a pharmaceutical, right, a biotech company moving into their space. And so we really approached it in two ways. We did some, I would say, boots on the ground research, and that we basically asked folks that were already in the space, how would you receive information? How would you view it, right? If a biotech company, if you all of a sudden saw them pop up, right, in the space, and what type of information would you expect to see from them? And then what type of information would absolutely turn you off, right, from engaging with them? And so that was really our validation. We didn't, I like to say in the digital space, especially in social, there's never just one definitive answer, right? It's really you gather information and then you make the best decision you can based on your particular right situation and your landscape. And so for us, we saw those as positive indicators that our presence would be well received.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so, are there any like metrics or other ways? Like, is there any data that confirms that to you that it is well received?
So, there's right in medical affairs, there's always the KPI and the metric discussion. And so we tried to be like going into this, we were very thoughtful about, okay, how can we gauge success? Like what would that look like for us and what do we need to show to convince others, right, within medical affairs and then also with our cross-functional partners that what we're doing is valuable. And so very on, we started with, simple, simple sort of KPIs and metrics like around impressions, right? Because one of the first questions was, is this a clear pathway for us to even be able to surface information to the right people, right? How will we know that we are sharing our information with right folks that are really interested in it? And so that was the first thing we did. And when you put out different, types of content, we had a variety, we straight text-based posts, some video posts, some Congress related, some publication related. We could definitely see that we were getting a fair number of impressions, which means our information was getting out to who we believe was the right people. And then over time, we moved to look at more sophisticated sort of metrics around engagement. So did we see people liking some of our posts? Did we see them bookmarking it? Did we see them clicking on some of the links, right? Did we see them download some of the information? Because I'll say, I feel like we were very thoughtful about our overall digital approach and that we didn't just go forward with, social channels. We also have a GMA website and we feel that, those two are very much linked. And so you often flow, we see HCPs flow from one to the other. And so we create content where we can actually, see if they're clicking, here or going here for deeper information.
Yeah, so you have basically embedded your social strategy into your digital omnichannel strategy.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Exactly. And we led with the website and then moved into social.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm going to switch gears for a second here because I heard that you're planning to expand into BlueSky. And I've been asking around in my own circles a little bit, like just asking people like if they know BlueSky, like in and outside medical affairs. And a lot of people told me that they had no idea. So maybe before we get into this, would you be able to explain what BlueSky is in a few sentences?
Yeah, so absolutely, I will. I'll give it my best effort. I'm not. I just want to caveat. I'm not an expert on all of the sort of social channels, but BlueSky is a relatively new social channel. It's structured very similarly to X. And so commonly you'll hear people say kind of the look and feel of it is very similar. And that's because, I don't know, the developer, right, had history at X. But it's a little bit more of an open platform, I feel like, that allows users to customize the content that they receive more so than what you can do on some of the other channels. It also allows you to really kind of pick up on a category of information and follow groups of people, individuals or groups at one time, as opposed to, right, clicking through and following, right, individual level, KOLs, for example. And so, people will wonder, well, why BlueSky? Again, right, we didn't find BlueSky. I have to be honest. BlueSky really found us. And the reason that I say that is our stakeholders brought BlueSky to us, right? So some of the folks that were on X and that, they knew that we were establishing a presence there. And so again, that told us like, oh, they're seeing us and they're following us. Like they may not always click on something, but we know they see the information. They told us that a large percentage of folks in the nephrology space were moving from X over to BlueSky. And so even some of the more formal type of programs that were operating, right, moved over, like a journal club and a March Madness type event that they were, different groups were hosting. They moved over. And so for us, it's really a no-brainer that because, we want to engage with the folks in which our information will be most useful, right, we needed to establish a presence there as well. And so for us, it's not an either or, it's an and. And so it's just us establishing, right, ourselves on an additional channel.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and so it really looks like the nephrologists are like early adopters, right? And I guess maybe another advantage, a temporary advantage will be that a lot of people are not yet used to this or known with this platform. So being present there right now for the foreseeable time will make you one of the few.
Exactly.
Yeah,
because it's additional people come, they'll already see us in the space, right? And hopefully we'll have an identity. But, I will say that as medical affairs organizations are deciding, right, which channel to pursue and, I would say definitely look to see where your stakeholders are. But in the end, there's no really right or wrong choice in terms of which channel you go with first and then in what order you might expand, right? I feel like it's just, a preference and you go with the, what at the time, and then you grow out from there.
Yeah, I really like that because I've been in a lot of discussions where, because it's kind of a difficult topic sometimes in organizations to get there in the first place, people kind of want guaranteed success, right? So, hey, Wesley, we can go do that, but you need to tell me like how much success we're gonna have, like almost kind of predict the metrics, right? And I think in reality, it doesn't really work like that. It's also a little bit of an exploration, and it isn't really, like you said, it's not like an or, but it's more an and, right? And it's more about figuring out how you can efficiently create content and manage the content across different platforms versus a scientific exercise to determine what the best platform is for you, right?
Exactly. And that can be a little bit of a stumbling block because in medical affairs, like we want every decision to be rooted in, right, a sound data and you have a whole process. But I feel like with digital overall, a lot of it is trial and error. And it's really a mindset of, let's assume a little bit of risk. Let's try this, even if it's a pilot, right? And then see where we land because it's so easy to pivot in the digital space, right? And so I actually see the risk of failure to be very small, right? Because I felt like you just pivot and adapt, right, to wherever you find yourself.
Hey, we need your help. The best way to help us grow and reach more medical affairs professionals is to share with your community. If you love our podcast, please hit subscribe, leave us a review, and that way we can keep sharing insights from the best and brightest in the medical communications industry. Let's push our industry forward together. So now, like Kimberly, if we would forget compliance just for a little bit, we'll get into that later. What would be the ideal constellation of social media networks? And maybe not particular for your organization, right? But like in general, for a medical affairs organization, how would you feel the matrix of platforms should look like?
You know what? I think that's a great question. What is the ideal mix? And I don't think there's one answer that works for everyone. Like I don't feel like there's a set of these three and everybody has to be right in this one space. I think you have to consider your goals, the goals of your organization. Like what are you hoping to achieve? Why are you moving into the space? Right? Because for some, it might simply be, there's a deficit of disease state information, right? And so you wanna move into the space as a resource. For other groups, it might be, there's you see that physicians and other HCPs have a lack of understanding around your data, right? And so you're going with a very specific reason that you want to share more specific information related to your studies and your outcomes, right? I think that dictates somewhat where you want to go because it also dictates where you'll find your stakeholders. For some medical affairs organizations, they are, they have physician groups, they have allied health groups, and they even have patients, right, that they're interacting with. For other groups, it is strictly an HCP audience because we know, based on the platform, sometimes you find them to be more, HCP oriented versus patient oriented. And so I would say consider your stakeholder and then just consider the format for your content, and that will help you decide your mix. So, for me, right, my vision would be to have a presence on some of the what I call more traditional channels where you're putting out, more kind of short snippets of, text-based information with maybe some graphics or some links. But then you also have what I feel like it's sort of next level platforms that we're seeing where there's a lot of content in video format, right? Versus short, pithy, videos, and then some longer form videos. I feel like that is where the space is evolving. And I feel like you'll catch most of your stakeholder mix if you have a presence, right, across both of those.
So does that mean I can't help but think when you talk about the video presence, for instance, like maybe channels that we have seen as more business to consumer channels like YouTube, Instagram, Pinterest.
Yeah, or even TikTok.
Or TikTok.
Right?
Yeah. Would you consider any of those part of the equation?
Oh, absolutely. And so, I would be honest, we did not consider those up front. When we were dipping our toe in the water, we wanted to pursue a more traditional format. And we used that basically as our pilot case to figure out, not just how our information would be received, but also for us, how we would generate all of the content right, that you are putting out. And so we felt that was a more sort of traditional pathway for us. But now that we're in this space and I'm just looking at, other physician specialty groups and the type of information that you see, I do think one of the platforms where you have more video-based content is a great expansion opportunity for us, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, funnily enough, even our Transforming Medical Communications podcast here, YouTube is actually one of our bigger channels.
Oh, interesting.
And I had always expected it would be, Spotify, Apple, but YouTube is by far the fastest growing channel.
Interesting.
And in my mind, it was kind of more research for business to consumer. So it's always interesting where it leads you. And I think looking at metrics and being courageous and piloting new concepts and ideas and platforms and then kind of see how it goes. And, you can always withdraw if it doesn't work out. I think
Exactly.
is a
And
good
that's
approach.
the key, right? With the pilot, you have complete control. And so if you dip your toe in and you see you're not seeing the outcomes or right, what have you, it's easy to pull back.
Let's talk a little bit about how to get this done, right? And with a nod towards, internal buy-in and compliance. So, I think compliance teams often aren't really opposed to social media, but I think they're opposed to the uncontrolled risk that it introduces, right? So when you went about this project, was there any specific objection or a moment where it felt like this, you might have not been able to pull it off?
I can't think I don't remember a specific moment where we felt like we ran into a completely closed door, right? I think that's because for two reasons. One, we were very thoughtful about our approach and we didn't just push forward, right? We didn't try to bulldoze right through the company into the space. We really looked at, some benchmarking. We looked to see what other companies, right, similar to Trevere, what they were doing in the space and what guardrails they had in place and what channels and what parameters. And so that benchmarking was absolutely huge for us because it gave us concrete information that we could share as examples of what companies were and were not doing. And I think that really helped us to really establish a baseline for why we wanted to do certain things, but also to set the stage for why we wanted to do some things that were different, right? Because we wanted to be leaders in the space. And so we didn't want to replicate what others were doing. We really wanted to, chart our own course. But the other important key is, we brought our cross-functional partners into the discussion with us very early. So we didn't try to go down a path where, we completely laid out our program, on our own. We had our compliance partners, we had our regulatory partners, our corporate communication partners, and then even some within medical affairs, because although, right, this initiative for us is led by the digital team, we're really dependent on all of our, right, cross-functional partners within medical affairs to participate in this to be successful, right? To help us with content generation, to help us with their strategic plan, to help us sometimes with the monitoring, right, aspects. And so we had everybody at the table early, so it felt like we were all on this journey together. The other thing that really helped us with is people brought their experience from other areas, right? And so just like medical affairs is exploring this, compliance teams are exploring this in their own forms. Regulatory teams are exploring this in their own forms. And so everyone brought that information and that experience, and that really helped us, I feel like, to develop, a really structured, credible program to support us on this journey.
Well, that sounds beautiful. Like I think there's so many examples in our industry where it's kind of, you have the medical communications people that want to do something, and then compliance, has issues with what I want to do, and they kind of lock horns quite quickly. How did you go about making this more of a co-creation process with them? You involved them early, but is there anything else you did to kind of really focus on how can we achieve our objectives versus maybe taking opposing sides?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of you have to help people see how this is beneficial for them or for their individual function, right? I very much see digital as one of the functional areas that can amplify the work of all the other groups, right? And so if you take a scientific communications team, for example, which, for me, I really view them as, pivotal because they're generating, right, a lot of our publications and our Congress abstracts and our posters and some of our other assets and, helping with medical affairs materials and, our educational strategy, both company-led as well as IME, right? And, we very quickly said, for all the great work you're doing, right, we can help amplify that. We can give you a greater platform and a larger audience to share that information. And so, sit here at the table with us and help us figure out, right, what's right for us as a company, and then how we can work together to make it happen. And so that I really think helped groups to say, oh, right, this is something that's going to help all of us. This isn't an individual functional level initiative, right? This is a medical affairs initiative. And it really gives us all a bigger stage.
Yeah. I think that's a really nice approach. Now, I'm sure compliance still maybe had some risks that they wanted you to cover, right? And I understood from you that you built some internal tools like an FAQ, an escalation protocol, and governance structure. So how did that turn out to? So I'm assuming, and you can fill in the blanks here, but I'm assuming that was to cover those risks. But then, like, how did that turn out to be useful in practice, and how did you go about creating that, perhaps?
Yeah, absolutely. I have to say, to the credit of my compliance and regulatory colleagues, they really helped to educate us because there were risks in this that, quite honestly, we didn't see ourselves. Right? With our medical affairs, I think, glasses on, we were very focused on like scientific credibility and, ensuring that everything we put out was accurate and it was aligned to our overall medical affairs strategy. We didn't think of some of the larger risks to the organization. And so they were great about really framing that out for us and helping us understand, like, this isn't a barrier for what you want to do. It's a consideration that we need to have an answer around. And so with that approach, again, we could say like, oh, okay, then let's figure out the one, the one thing I would say is, and I would say almost every case in which a medical affairs organization is moving into the space, the company, right, through their corporate communications group already has, forged this path. And there is a corporate presence on social media. And so, one of the first things we did was reach out to that group to say, oh, okay, you guys are already in the space. What processes and, pathways that you put together internally to sort of help you, right, to manage this? And what are your guardrails and how do you operate? Because then we could just take that and, tailor it to a medical affairs approach or add to it in some cases because we were doing different things in the space than they were. But absolutely, you need you need a governance structure that really clearly illustrates, where this sits within medical affairs, like who ultimately is the decision maker, right? Both for, future forward movement, but also when issues arise, right? Who's the one person that you go to, right, to raise the flag and say, we have a particular concern that we need to work through.
Yeah, yeah. I can't help but be very curious about that. Like, did you ever have to use that part of the plan? Was there any situation where you had to kind of, use the escalation plan or where you had to test it, perhaps?
You know what? I think that's a great case. We put together like a governance structure. We put together a content generation and review process structure to ensure we could, feed into MRC in the right way. Because of course, right, we're adding to, the load of the information that goes through MRC. And so we wanted to ensure we were working with them to understand, we were also providing information in a new way. And so how it would be best to provide that to them to facilitate, right, an easier review process and all of that. But an escalation pathway, I really didn't go into this thinking of an escalation pathway. But again, through working with our my Corp Comms partner, right, they explained why it's important to have an escalation pathway, because the one thing about, right, being out in the space is it is wide open, meaning you can go in and post something with the best of intentions, and you might have someone that just reacts to it negatively, or they're targeting, right, the company for some specific reason, or there's just a misunderstanding. And you do need to have a clear pathway of one, monitoring, right, your site, but also that how you're responding if you find yourselves in that situation. And so we are very fortunate in that although we've had to reference our pathway, we've always just been at, like the base case where we went to remind ourselves, oh, okay, if this happens, what do we need to do? And in the few cases that we've done that, it's just been very simple things within the medical affairs, right, response to something. We have not had to escalate any higher in the organization. And so we're very fortunate. And even when we did our research into this, right, into escalation pathways and, how companies handle, different things that can occur, overall, there's not a ton of situations where companies come under attack or, So sometimes in our mind, we can overinflate the risk, right? And you scare yourself into not wanting to move forward. But really, we haven't found it to be particularly, risky or anything.
Yeah, I guess it's a matter of better safe than sorry, right? And
Absolutely.
I think
Because if you
seeing,
need it, you want to
yeah,
have it in place.
exactly, yeah, and
Right.
and and it helps to be aware of any risk that could be there. Yeah,
Absolutely. I mean, something simple, right? Someone could respond on social media about an adverse event, right? And you have to have a pathway of how that will be addressed, how it will be captured and then addressed, right? And funneled to the right, to your PB group within your organization. And so some of it is very simple, right? Things, and then others are, sort of different. But again, it's very unlikely that, folks will land in that situation. Yeah.
so earlier we spoke a little bit about metrics already,
Mhm.
and I guess we spoke about it more from assessing the impact. Like, is this a good way to communicate to our audience? But now we're talking about buy-in. The topic of metrics comes to mind again because it's also, I guess, the best way to show executive leadership that
Mhm.
the effort and budget we're investing in this is worth it, right? So
Mhm.
could you tell us a little bit more about the use of metrics in that realm, like whether positive or maybe not so much, right? Like sometimes I know often we work on digital projects all the time, so sometimes
Mhm.
when the immediate results aren't immediately visible, people get a little bit nervous, like how was this like a waste of time and budget, while it just needs a little bit more time. So I'm just kind of wondering about your overall experience using metrics for internal buy-in.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned early, we thought about metrics from the very beginning and that how will we convey, right, our impact and our success in this space. And so we did come up with like a standard, kind of set of metrics around, downloads or, likes and views and bookmarking. Um, but we also, I think it's important to educate, right, from day one that a lot of information on social channels is passively consumed, right? Meaning people, they see it, they read about it, it leaves a little bit of imprint, and that's all without them clicking, right, or doing anything with it. And so we did a lot of education around, ways people consume information, especially in the digital space. And we did that education alongside, right, talking about, however, these are the KPIs and the metrics that we're going to use, right, to kind of validate our program. And so I would say, initially some of the metrics, like, of course, you go into it and you're hoping that with your very first, right, batch of content, that you immediately see, right, your HCPs, liking something or bookmarking or reacting to it, right, in some way. And so initially, even I myself was a little disappointed because I wanted the numbers to be right high, like through the roof. And we did not necessarily see that. But we were able to quickly confirm that the information, however, was getting to the right people. So we knew they were seeing it. Right. And so we had to really kind of reassess like, well, how long should it take before you actually have people interacting with your content if you do at all? Right. Because it may be a situation where, people see it and they take it in, but they don't do anything. And so we just really, continue to educate, right, both within medical affairs and outside of medical affairs. But what we do know is You will, for whatever reason, post some particular set of content. For us, it's been a lot around our data that's presented at congresses, where you will definitely see a spike, right, in engagement, right? And we're always super excited about that because you use that to then figure out what was it about that piece, right, that really resonated with your audience? Was it, the results themselves? Was it the format for the content? Was it the timing of it? Was it because you linked to something else? Or, was it because maybe the hashtags that you utilized really, right, caught the right group of people? Or maybe it's because you tagged in a particular leader in the space. And so people, right, immediately engaged with it. And so that's really the stage where we are now, where we're looking at all of those different factors for each piece of content to really help us chart our path forward. The other thing I will say that's been just an eye opener is once you produce, some content that's downloadable, say it's a visual abstract or an infographic, and you see that in use later by, right, the DOL or KOL or somebody that's picked that up and they're, right, that is a sure sign that what you're producing is both credible and useful to your target stakeholder group. And so we've seen some big wins in that space.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's definitely a great point.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So maybe like in closing, Kimberly, if someone is listening here and they're kind of on the fence, maybe worried about some risk, the resources needed, or maybe they're first one in the company to actually try this, what would be your case for, why does the upside outweighs the risk, and why is now the time to start?
So that's a great question, Wesley. I would say um, the 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 potential wins outweigh the risk. It's almost to the point where I feel like you can't afford to not try to move into the space, right? I think, as I mentioned earlier, in our minds, we inflate the risk and it seems like an insurmountable hurdle. Not the case. Actually, just, pick do some research, pick a single platform, right? And dip your toe into the water with it and see how it goes. It will give both you, right, in medical affairs, the confidence that you can do it, but also others in the organization who also may be worried about risk will see it's not as risky as one might believe. And so I say, though, approach this with a solid plan, right? Both on the medical affairs side in terms of, your goals and objectives, what you're looking to achieve, be clear on who your target, right, audience is, like who are you hoping to engage with, and then a process for your content. Because I don't want to underestimate, to be in the social space, you really typically, generate a lot of content and you really have to have processes and pathways in place to do that right efficiently and not burn out your whole medical affairs team. But then also from a company perspective, be clear that it's your goal to go into this compliantly. And so develop your governance structure, right? Develop your escalation plans, develop your plan to, capture and report AEs and present that up front, reassuring everyone that you're being thoughtful, right, about this and work on it as a team. Involve your cross-functional partners from day one because they will help you think through this and create a plan that's right for your organization.
Well, Kimberly, time is flying, as they say. I found this really insightful. Thank you so much for sharing your insights here with our audience. I think a lot of people, will be benefiting from these insights that you shared with us today.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me, Wesley, and I hope to come back and visit with you again soon.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Thank you.
Transforming Medical Communications is brought to you by MedCom's experts. To find out more about MedCom's experts and how we create some of the most cutting-edge medical communications programs anywhere in the world, visit www.medcoms-experts.com. And then make sure to search for Transforming Medical Communications in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts, or anywhere else podcasts are found. Make sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at MedCom's experts, thanks for listening.